Right. Give me a reaction if you can hear me okay. You can go down to the bottom of your interface there and give me a thumbs up, a hearts emoji, or a jellyfish emoji if you want. You can figure that out. Let me know down in the chat if you can hear me okay. Welcome to World Jellyfish Day. We'll get started here in just a little while. In the meantime, if you feel up to it, go ahead and type in the chat. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Opened up the chat now, and we're coming to you live from Sarasota, Florida for World Jellyfish Day. All right, we got folks coming in from Washington State. You have gobs and gobs of cool jellies over there on the West Coast. You're looking live into our Jelly Cam. We'll get underway here in just a little bit. This is brought to you in part by Marvin, the Mote Aquarium Roving Virtual Exhibit Navigator, now live here at the new Mote Science Education Aquarium. You can find out more about these programs by visiting our website at mote.org/Marvin. With this virtual cart, we can pretty much go anywhere in the aquarium, and today we're going to be visiting the Aquarium Conservation Lab and learning about jellies. We also have this program here called Ask the Ocean. This is a fun way if you have any questions about oceanic topics, you can send us your questions, your deep thoughts and suspicions about the world, and we'll try our best to research them and answer them either live during our Ask the Ocean sessions or via email through our interactive forum. And we have another free event coming up this Wednesday. I have to fix that date here. Let me do that real quick, because that is November 5th. Yep, November 5th. That will be when we are doing this program with Julie Henry. She's written a book about leadership through the lens of her experience and career working with wildlife at zoos and aquariums, and she wrote it with her family. Tasman and Kepler helped write the book with her, and that'll be a program we have on November 5th at 1 o'clock as a prelude to the Youth Ocean Conservation Summit coming up here at the aquarium live in person. That'll be this Saturday, or Saturday the 15th, but we'll do a live stream with Julie on the 5th. And you can scan that QR code to find out more. And this is an interactive program, so if you want, you can tune in with our bingo game. That's optional, but you can get live and interactive with that. And of course, like any bingo game, if I say the word or it appears up on screen, you can mark it off on your board. Of course, we'll play across, down, or diagonally. And there's no prizes this time, but just a fun satisfaction of a game well played. And you might also want to have a couple of other things to get ready. Paper or notebooks, pen or pencil. Since this is a webinar, you're going to have your microphones and cameras turned off, but be ready to type. You should be able to type into the chat right now. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What city and state are you watching from, if you want to share those details with me? I have some folks tuning in from Washington, but where else are people tuning in from? Let me know in the chat, or give me a reaction. Make sure that I can know that you can hear me okay. You should be able to put a little reaction down there into the Zoom call down at the bottom and let me know. Now we've got folks turning in from upstate New York. And I've got some family up there in Ithaca. Wonderful place to visit. In fact, Mote has a little bit of a history there. One of our early directors, Harry Gilbert, was a scientist up at Cornell in upstate New York. Came down to Florida to run the lab in the 1960s. All right, Southside Elementary. So glad you're tuning on in. And just going to give it another second or two here while we have folks joining the conversation, joining the webinar today. In the meantime, you get some of my fabulous jellyfish jokes while we stand by and wait for folks to join in. So what is a comb jelly's favorite time of day? 1804. That one will explain it later in the program. How do you untangle a sea nettle? You add a comb jelly to straighten it out. We are recording this program, so you'll be able to tune on in again once we post it to our website, in case you miss anything today or want to share it with any friends who couldn't join us today. What did the jellyfish say to the star? Oh, no, wait, that's the next one. What do jellyfish worry about the most? Current events. I've got these. There we go. And what did the jellyfish say to the star coral? You are very popular. Popular. So we are coming to you live from our Aquarium Conservation Lab, a new space here at Mote, where we've got quite a few of these jellies growing in our chrysals, ultimately to be put on exhibit here. What's a jellyfish's favorite kind of math? Geometry. They love those bell curves. All right, we're just going to give you a couple more of these. I think there's everybody into the webinar that wanted to join us today. You make a jellyfish laugh. You give them tentacles, all right? All right. Let's get started with our program for Jellyfish Jamboree. This is World Jellyfish Day, and my name is Jason Robert Shaw, coming to you live from the Mote Science Education Aquarium here in Sarasota, Florida. I'm dressed up just for the occasion. I got my World Jellyfish Day shirt on. J is for jellyfish. So we're going to have that going on today here in this new space that we're enjoying. And it's something cool that we can share with all of you all. In fact, here, let me go ahead and switch my camera around because there are folks live here as well. They're on the other side of the glass watching along with us. And they'll be kind of tuning in too and paying attention, I hope. But if you have any questions during our program, go ahead and type them into the chat. Let me know. And you can participate that way. We also had the bingo game that you can follow along with as well. And so you can tune in that way with our bingo baker. And I sent out an email about that earlier, so that's how you can get that information. But this is one of the things we call our wonderful animal virtual encounters, where we can take this cart called Marvin anywhere basically in the aquarium and bring these experiences to you. So welcome. And we'll be talking a little bit about the life cycle of jellyfish, what it is that we're doing in this laboratory in the first place, and sharing all of that with you today. And so let's go ahead and practice. If you want to, again, haven't already, type into the chat. Let me know where you're tuning in from. Again, we're here in Sarasota, but I see that we have some friends that were here from New York, upstate New York, as well as Washington. Where else are folks tuning in from as well? Let me know by typing into the chat. We got folks from Boston as well. And of course, our friends from Southside Elementary, thank you so much for watching today. And let me go ahead and show you on my map just exactly where I'm speaking to you from. We're down here in Florida, where Mote was actually founded about 70 years ago by a really remarkable scientist. Her name was Dr. Eugenie Clark. And we moved up to our present location for the lab, City Island, back in the 1980s. And we've had this public aquarium open in this location over here on a barrier island for about 40 odd years. But we have just recently opened a brand new $138 million facility just for you all to come on by whenever you're visiting us in the area in Sarasota and check it out. And this brand new aquarium opened just a few weeks ago, featuring, of course, jellyfish, but also penguins, giant Pacific octopus, and a nearly 400,000-gallon saltwater aquarium featuring fish from the Gulf. And as I said, we were founded by this really remarkable scientist named Dr. Eugenie Clark. She almost single-handedly started a lab down in an area called Cape Hayes Marine Laboratory, and she was famous for her research on sharks, so much so that she became known as the Shark Lady. But we've since expanded to about 38 other research areas, everything from sea turtles and manatees to seagrass, and of course, also jellyfish. And the main area that we do with jellyfish is to grow them here at our lab. And so that's what you can see here in this aquarium husbandry conservation lab. So when you think about the word jellyfish, which get ready to type into the chat here, what words come to mind? How would you describe jellies to someone who's never actually seen them before? What words would you use to describe a jellyfish? It's kind of right there in their name, right? A little bit gelatinous. So that might be one word that you use. What other words come to mind? Wiggly and squishy. Yeah, those are some words that come to my mind as well. What else? They can sting. Maybe they're a little bit dangerous, right? Of course, they're usually transparent, though some of them can have some interesting colors in them. Here are some words that people have come up with, and they describe the word jelly. Some people think they're very beautiful, right? Especially the flowing, pulsating view of the Medusa stage of their life cycle. Transparent. They're an important part of the ecosystem too, right? Colorful, yeah. They can be smelly, especially if they wash up on our beaches. In fact, I've seen that happen here in Sarasota. Sometimes jellyfish wash up on our beaches. Has anyone actually touched a jellyfish or been touched by a jellyfish before? What did it feel like? Kind of squishy, and yet the outer part of them is kind of firm, right? When you actually touch a jellyfish, some of them sting quite badly, so hopefully you know which animal you're working with. But these are moon jellies, and they usually don't affect you unless you're really especially allergic to them. But the top part of them, the bell, is kind of firm, but like a gel, hence the name jellyfish. And they can be quite squishy. And of course, if you're not too careful, you can actually get stung by them. Has anyone had that displeasure of being stung by a jellyfish? Maybe curious how that happens? Now, if you're someone who's experienced a mild jellyfish sting, you can follow a couple of safety steps, right? Don't pee on it. That's a myth, wives' tale. But you also don't want to use fresh water. Instead, rinse it with vinegar, acetic acid. That helps to neutralize the venom. And if vinegar is not available, people say use salt water instead. But if you use fresh water, you can actually cause those stinging cells to release even more venom. And certainly don't want that. And if those tentacles are actually sticking to you, you can use something like a pair of tweezers or even a credit card to try to gently remove anything visibly sticking to you. And then and you seek medical assistance if you need to. Applying very hot water up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees centigrade is what they recommend. And sometimes you need to leave the affected area in there for about 20 to 40 minutes to help reduce the pain and inactivate the toxins. And some people varies if they can be stung by, they have to have tentacles. All jellyfish have some kind of stingers in them. They're part of a group of animals that do. Various people are affected by them at various levels depending on your reaction to them. And then has anyone actually tasted jellyfish before? Yeah, there's a new Asian market that opened up here in Sarasota where you can actually buy jellyfish in packets like these and add them to maybe a salad. People do eat jellyfish. They have to be specially prepared. And there's only certain kinds that are usually marketed, but they usually put them in the salty brine And then you have to rinse them really well, or else they're very, very salty and not always fun to eat directly from the package. But it can be an interesting texture when you add them to a salad or something similar. And so today we're going to be thinking about these critters. How does a jellyfish move, for instance? It doesn't have a brain and doesn't have muscles like we do. So how do these animals move around? That's one of the things we'll think about today. And also think about, why might jellyfish be an important part of the ecosystem? They're out there causing trouble for us, stinging us, but what role do they have in the ocean? And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And some people think that there are more jellyfish today than in the past. Is that actually true? Well, we'll talk a little bit about that. But the first thing you need to know about jellyfish is they are not fish. Well, it used to be that sailors and scientists and naturalists would call pretty much anything in the water a fish, no matter what it was. And sea snake would be a kind of fish. A squid would be called an inkfish. And so these gelatinous things would be called jellyfish. But in fact, they're in a group that I like to call sea jellies, just to help avoid confusion. And let's actually compare a sea jelly to a true bony fish, like this perch here. Of course, they both live in water. Okay, that checks out. But in the case of the fish, they are what we call vertebrates. They have a backbone, a spine, whereas jellyfish, there's no bones about them. They are what we call invertebrates, so they don't have any kind of supporting structure like we do. There's no skull, no bones, no structure like that at all. Now, how do they get their oxygen? How do they breathe? Well, the fish, they have those gills, right? And so they have the little flaps next to the sides of their head, and water comes in their mouth and then out their gills, and that's how they breathe. But jellyfish do it differently. They actually absorb oxygen through the skin via a process that's called diffusion. So just basically floating around there, and they have very thin, what we call permeable skin. So oxygen can diffuse into the skin, and carbon dioxide can diffuse out. And as I said, if there's no vertebrae, there's no spine, they have no central nervous system. Now, fish do. They have a brain, and they have a spine, and they have nerves like you and I do. But jellyfish, they don't have a brain. Instead, they have kind of like a network of little nerves, or a nerve net that runs around through their body. And that's what actually controls how they move. And so as the jellyfish kind of squirts its way through the ocean, if it encounters something, maybe a little bit of pressure or maybe something nibbling on it, it can sense that with those nerve nets, but it doesn't feel it in the same way that maybe you and I do. So those are some of the things that are similar, but also some things that are different between a true fish and a sea jelly. But what is a jellyfish? Well, that's where it comes in, where we file them under C, as I like to say. File them under the letter C because they are in a group of animals called cnidarians. So here, let's see if you can answer this question. Which one are jellyfish, or sea jellies, most closely related to? Do you think it's 1, sea slugs, 2, comb jellies, 3, corals, or 4, sea squirts? Type into the chat 1, 2, 3, or 4. Which do you think is the closest cousin to sea jellies or jellyfish? And here, let me give you a little bit of a hint. We'll eliminate some of the answers. So it's either 2 comb jellies or 3 corals. What do you think now? What do you think is the closest cousin to jellies? Well, the best answer is actually number 3. Corals and jellies are actually very closely related because, again, they're in this group that I like to call the cnidarians. Now, the C is silent, but it comes from a Greek word meaning nettle. Nettle is a type of stinging plant, and so they've applied that same kind of concept to these stinging animals, the cnidarians, and all of them have some kind of stinging cells to them. Now, they also have some other cousins too, the anthozoans or the sea anemones. So you probably have seen these on Finding Nemo, right? We have these critters here where the clownfish live in and around the tentacles, right? So sea anemones and jellyfish are closely related, and perhaps you can see the family resemblance, right? Sea anemone is basically just an upside down jellyfish, right? And it sticks itself closely to the bottom. So anthozoans is the scientific name for jellies, but also includes things like corals and a group called the sea pens. And then maybe more familiar for those of you who are taking biology classes in high school, there's a group called the hydrozoans, which includes the little hydra found in lakes and rivers and streams, but also the Portuguese man-o'-war. But these are the ones we're going to be talking about mostly today, the true jellies, the scyphozoans, of which there are about 200 different kinds in the world that have been described so far. And then there's also another weird group called the box jellies. Those can be quite painful and potentially deadly for us. Those are the ones that have such powerful stings, and they can actually potentially kill a person. Incredible. But yeah, everything about jellies has to do with those stingers. They are animals, they are not plants. They do live in water. Most live in salt water, although there are some freshwater species. In fact, I grew up in a lake up in Hillsborough County, and as I was paddling along one day, I saw this little medusa in a freshwater lake. It's the craziest thing in the world. So there are some freshwater jellyfish, believe it or not, but they're not very common. Most of them live in salt water. And here you can see some of those sea anemones, as well as those larger lion's mane jellies and other types. This is what we call the medusa stage. And all of them have the same characteristic, those stinging cells called nematocysts. These are like little harpoons wrapped up inside a high pressure jelly filled sac down inside of them. They're microscopic, but they can have millions of these little stinging cells inside their skin, and they can use those to grab their prey. Usually they're eating little tiny floating things in the ocean like plankton, which is their favorite food. But there's some that are strong enough to catch fish or potentially larger animals as well. And so those stinging cells are what characterizes and ties them all together. Now, these videos I just showed you came from a group called The Shape of Life, and I encourage you to check out their website at shapeoflife.org. But really cool imagery there of a nematocyst in action. Now, if you encounter a large group of jellyfish, like right around here behind me, that has a special collective noun name, they have encountered a smack of jellyfish. That's the term we use for a group of jellyfish. And maybe you're somebody who's deathly afraid of jellyfish, right? Maybe you think that they're very, very scary. You have scyphophobia, which is fear, skin, jellyfish. So that's scyphophobia if you're somebody who's afraid of jellies. Now, I hope you're not too afraid of jellies because we're actually going to visit quite a few of them today. And in order to do that, we're going to have you get your aquarium map here. Hopefully you can see that. This is a little layout of the third floor of the aquarium. And just to my right are the manatees and the river otters, but we're up here in the corner in the Aquarium Conservation Lab. And like any good visit to an aquarium, I need you to grab your ticket. So virtually reach out and get your ticket there. And we are going to head on up these escalators. There's 3 levels to the aquarium, and we're going to head up to the top floor and come into here, the Jellyfish Conservation or Aquarium Conservation Lab, where we are growing all kinds of moon jellies and another group called the Australian Spotted Jelly. And here you can see them in action right there, growing in our chrysals. So these are moon jellies that are growing here. And they're kind of a good representative example of this kind of critter, the moon jellies. They're what we call planktonic animals. Their location is largely determined by currents and tides, though they do have the ability to kind of pulsate, as you see there, and swim up and down in the water column. And also they can turn and orient themselves so that their tentacles can hang below them. And those hanging tentacles are flowing in the currents, and that increases their chance of catching prey. So let's take a look at the anatomy of these creatures here. And so I said they're graded on a bell curve. Remember that? And so that was kind of a joke there because the top part of the jelly is called the bell or the umbrella. And then the part that's hanging down below them are the tentacles. And so these are usually the parts that have most of the stinging cells on them, but they also have these larger kinds of tentacles hanging underneath them. These are called their oral arms. And if you looked at these underneath a microscope, you would actually see that they have dozens, millions of little tiny hair cells, what we call cilia, that help to move food that they capture with their tentacles and into the center part of their body called the mouth. And so that's where they eat their food, is right there in the center. And we've kind of done a little cutaway there, and you can see there's not too much to the insides of a jelly. They're not that complicated. But this video here also shows a very nice series of canals throughout their body. Those are used to move fluid and nutrients around the animal. In fact, let's do a little diagram here, and you can see there's those oral arms right here, and kind of makes a cross in the middle of the animal. And so that's what's used to feed the moon jelly. But remember I said that they can sense their environment through their nerve bent, but they also have a series of little eye spots, or what we call rhopalium. Now, they're not eyeballs like you and I have, but they do have these little sensory cells right around the edge of their bell or their umbrella that allows them to sense light from dark, for example. and that allows them to orient themselves also in the water column. Now they don't, what else do you not see in here? Do you see the brain? Do you see lungs or a heart? Not really, right? That translucent layer between the outer epidermis or skin and the inner gastrodermis is called the mesoglia, and that's the tough part. It also provides some structural support for them. It's full of these proteins and collagen fibers, but it's also flexible and acts as what we call a hydrostatic skeleton, and that allows them to bounce back or helps facilitate movement. But mostly they're composed of water. Up to 95 to 98% of these jellyfish here behind me, they're mostly water, and so they have the potential to dry out if they wash up on the beach. And then through a muscular contraction, food travels along the oral arms to what's called the manubrium, a central tube in the middle of the bell that's connected to their mouth and then to their gastrovascular cavity or stomach, basically. Now, inside the ropalium are not only sensory structures for light and dark, but also specialized structures that are called statocysts, which allow them to, again, orient up from down and know which direction they're pointed in. Let's take a closer look here. And you can see they also have these series of canals. Those radio canals help to disperse the food throughout the system as it's being digested. So even though they seem pretty simple, lots of parts in there, including reproductive parts where male and female jellies can end up making more jellies. In fact, let's talk a little bit about jellyfish life cycle in our next phase here. Adult male moon jellies will often release their reproductive cells into the water. Those get ingested by the females, and those females then brood little larvae inside of their oral arms for several days, potentially weeks. And then eventually those larvae are released or settle onto the seafloor. So here you can see a couple of adults. They're free swimming. Males and females reproduce through this process of spawning, and then the females brooding the eggs. And the baby jelly, when it first starts out, is called a planula larvae. It's this little tiny rice-sized creature, sometimes even smaller than that. And again, has little hairs on it called cilia. And it can swim around in the water for a couple of days before finally settling down and metamorphosing into something called a polyp, which looks like a little miniature sea anemone and rests right there down at the bottom of the ocean. And can sit down there for seasons at a time, for weeks, potentially years, until the water conditions get just right when it begins to transform. And then this phase is what we call an asexual phase, but eventually it can begin to bud or make little clones of itself. This is a process called scyphostoma, or strobilation, and those little top buds there will break off and form what's called an ephyra, or basically a little baby larvae jellyfish that then can swim away and start the whole life cycle all over again. But the really remarkable part of jellyfish is that they have this two-part life cycle to them, this free swimming stage that looks very much like the jellyfish that you probably recognize, right? We call this the Medusa stage. But what a lot of people don't realize is that there's a second part to a jellyfish's life cycle where there's these teeny tiny little polyps, again, almost smaller than a grain of rice, that sit down at the bottom of the ocean, at the bottom of the bay or canal. This is the sedentary stage, just waiting for conditions to get just right before they begin to split off and begin to make lots and lots of little clones of themselves. And so that's part of the process that we're doing here in our aquarium. We actually have several of these special aquariums set up here, and it's going to be kind of hard for you to see on this angle, but I'll show you a close-up view that I recorded earlier. But they're actually the polyp stage of the moon jellies in this aquarium right here. And we use these special aquariums called chrysals because, jellyfish are kind of delicate. And if we had them in a regular old aquarium, they could potentially get torn up by the pumps and by the plumbing. But here there's no sharp angles. It keeps them away from the plumbing, and also not a lot of air bubbles in here, just enough to keep the current going. Because the other thing that can sometimes happen when you're trying to grow jellyfish, a little tiny air bubble gets stuck underneath the bell, and it acts like a little drill because the air bubble is buoyant, wants to go up to the surface, and actually drill a little tiny hole eventually through the top of the jellyfish, and you end up with a Swiss cheese like a jelly if you have a lot of air bubbles in the aquarium with them. So we try to avoid that as well. So how do jellies move without a brain or muscles like ours? Well, they use this process that you can see here called pulsation for locomotion. They have these clear circular muscle bands in that bell, which contract. And as they contract, it squeezes water out from underneath the bell, and that propels the jellyfish forward. And between the pulsations, that special transparent tissue inside of them is called mesoglia. It actually kind of recoils like a spring, and that restores the shape of the bell. So it's a very energy efficient form of movement. And of course, they're also passively pushed along by the current. But it's amazing. That simple nerve net, that decentralized network of neurons that's inside them actually controls these basic functions, all without really a brain like you and I have. And here we go. Here's those little polyp stage I was talking about earlier. Here's a nice close-up view of them. There's actually two versions of the jellyfish here. This is that little Scyphostoma stage that kind of looks like a little sea anemone. And so they can hang out at the bottom like this for, again, a very long time. But they also have this little resting stage called a podocyst, where conditions are especially bad. They can hang out in this little cyst-like stage for a very long time. It's a very hardy version of the jelly, can survive for years in that form. But then the podocysts will actually return to their polyp-shaped form and continue to grow once water conditions to improve. And then that polyp can then branch out and clone itself and eventually pop off into those little miniature jellies and start the whole life cycle all over again. In fact, here, you want to see a baby jellyfish? Look real close. Let's squint here. You see them? It's only about the size of a pencil eraser, maybe a little smaller. And so these are what we call the ephyra stage. So at about 62 degrees Fahrenheit in the spring, these little polyps that we saw earlier actually begin to grow and elongate and clone themselves. And then they go through that process called strobilation. And then the little ends of the polyps break free. And those little parts that break free are little clones, little ephyra. And they begin to quickly feed on plankton. Now, we don't have plankton here all the time for the jellies. Instead, we kind of grow it our own. We have algae, as well as something called rotifers, and also sea monkeys, also known as brine shrimp. And these are an easy to grow live food that we can offer to not only the jellies, but a variety of other critters here at the aquarium, like seahorses and other fish. And this is the primary diet of these animals. In fact, we look closely here. Let's see if I can bring it up. I'll try to zoom in a little bit more. You might notice that the jellyfish here, I've got a purple light on them. But if we look closely enough, sometimes you can see over here that the center of them is a little darker where the oral arms connect. And that's where they've eaten up quite a few of the brine shrimp that were growing behind me. And it looks like they've already digested their morning meal. So most of them look kind of clear and transparent. Now, this is some video of the old laboratory when we were growing up another group of jellies called the sea nettles. And you can see that these are a little bit different than the moon jellies. They have these long stinging tentacles and those strong nematocysts, and they use that to capture and paralyze their prey. Now, they're not especially toxic to humans, though you can get quite a sting from sea nettles. And they are predators. They feed on comb jellies and other jellyfish. So we can sometimes feed the moon jellies to the sea nettles. That's one of their favorite things to eat. In fact, the aquarist will feed these nettles about one moon jelly per day. There's some other kinds of jellies. We don't have these on display currently, but in the past, we've had this one here, which is kind of crazy to look at. It's called an upside down jelly. Almost looks like a sea anemone. But these live in shallow waters in Florida and the Caribbean, especially in mudflats around mangroves. And they also have another nickname, the mangrove jellyfish. And an interesting relationship that these animals have with some symbiotic algae that lives in their tissue. In fact, you can kind of see they're yellowish, greenish in color. That's because the algae lives inside of them, and algae goes through the same process that plants go through, photosynthesis, turning sunlight into energy. And as it turns those sunlight into energy, it is basically making little sugars that leak out of the algae and help to feed the jelly as well. All right, my friends, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat. I'll do my best to answer them for you. And we'll have an opportunity for you to ask me any other questions that you might have at the very end here. I'm almost at the end of my presentation to you. Now, the other interesting thing about the mangrove jellyfish is that they don't really sting in the same way that other jellies do. Instead of having long tentacles with stingers inside, when they're disturbed, they release what are called mucus grenades. They are little blobs of jelly filled with not only algae, but also little stinging cells. And so some of our scientists have been looking at these animals and swimming through the canals, and there's a bunch of these jellies, and then all of a sudden, all these little blobs of stinging mucus impact them, and they get knocked with those. So that can be quite an experience. This is another species that we have here at our aquarium, the white-spotted jellyfish. This is actually native to the West Pacific from Australia to Japan, but it's been introduced to several places, including to the Gulf. It's thought that the polyps were carried on in shipping ballasts. So those big container ships came over and through the Panama Canal and released those little tiny podocysts, or maybe the polyps somehow got released. And so there's the potential that this species could threaten the shrimp harvest in the Gulf or other species. We really don't know. They can grow up to about 2 feet across, and right now there's no natural predators for them. And so this has been something of concern, a non-native, exotic, invasive species that could potentially disrupt the ecosystem. Another one that has the potential to do that is various kinds of comb jellies. But an interesting thing about these critters is that even though they look like true jellies, they have no stinging cells. Instead, you can see they have those 8 rows of little tiny fused cilia inside of them, those little hair cells. They use those to move around, but they are like little vacuums out there in the ocean. And so even though they're not true jellies, they do hoover up a lot of the plankton that's out there in the ocean. And when you see them in just the right angle of light, that light bounces off those little beating cilia and actually kind of gives it a rainbow hue, which is kind of cool. They're not really glowing per se, but they do have these little refraction, kind of like little prisms in their hair algae or in their hairs as they're moving along. And then there's another kind of relative of the jellies, the anemones, and we don't currently have a lot of the Caribbean and Gulf species on display, but we have some cold water anemones. But of course, in the Indo-Pacific, there's another symbiotic relationship between the anemones and the clownfish, which you probably know about if you've ever seen Finding Nemo before, right? The clownfish have the unique ability to actually swim in and around the tentacles of the anemone without getting stung. How do they do that? Well, one of the theories is that the clownfish actually kind of coats themselves with the mucus or the slime of the anemone. And basically, the anemone recognizes the clownfish as its own tissue, and so it doesn't activate its stingers. But the anemones have a nice, safe place to live, and the anemone gets the benefit as well. They are kind of messy eaters, the clownfish, and so they might drop a little bit of food in there and help to feed the anemones as well. And structurally, they're very similar to jellyfish. But again, as I said, they're kind of upside down jellies, but they still have tentacles, a mouth, and a stomach for digesting their food. All right, let's take a little moment here and see if you have any questions for me. So let me look here into our aquarium, or into my chat space rather, and see if you have any questions for me. Yeah, and so there you go. Jellyfish have various lengths of tentacles. So in this case, we're looking at the moon jellies behind me, and their stingers are not very long at all. See if I can zoom in a little bit more on them. They're kind of transparent, so they're hard to see. I'll do my best to focus in here. So on the moon jellies, it's just a little fringe, a little tutu of stingers right around the edges. Compare that to those video of the sea nettles that I showed you earlier, when they have those long hair-like tentacles. And in the case of the lion's mane jellyfish, those can get quite huge. In fact, their tentacles and length can be longer than a blue whale. So they're absolutely enormous. So there are all kinds of jellies. There are some that are teeny tiny and stay that way their whole life. And then there are some that are huge, as big as a ship or a whale, absolutely large. And why do jellyfish get up to 2 feet wide, especially the white spotted? That's just their size. They're not absolutely huge compared to, say, something like a Portuguese man o' war or even those sea nettles, but they do get about 2 feet long, full grown. The ones that we have here at the aquarium are usually smaller. They're about the size of your hand, full length, and the actual bells are only about the size of a $50 or so. So they don't get absolutely huge. And then there's the other relative of the jellies that we talked about, the corals. And so we study those here at the lab quite a bit too. They also have a very simple body opening with only one opening, the mouth. Their mouth is surrounded by a ring of stinging tentacles. We have any number of live corals here on display. In fact, we rescue and restore coral reefs as well. And they also have a symbiotic relationship with algae in their tissue, kind of like the upside down jelly. They have an energy partner inside of them called zooxanthellae. Those little algae produce sugars for them too. But the corals can also feed on brine shrimp and other things that we feed them, or plankton out in nature. But a lot of the beautiful colors that corals get come from the algae that are in their tissue, but they can get it from another source as well. Many cnidarians have these fluorescent colors, especially under bright blue light. That fluorescent proteins inside of them help to absorb light. And it might serve as a sunblock and help to filter out UV light. And scientists have actually used this special property of corals and jellies, this fluorescent property. They've managed to figure out which proteins code for that and extract it, and actually been able to stick it into other animals as well. And it's kind of revolutionized cell biology by allowing scientists to track gene expression as well as protein localization in living organisms. And you might have seen a knockoff or a side effect of that in the glowfish that you can find at pet stores. So these zebra danio fish have had the jellyfish gene inserted into them. And because of that, they can glow underneath blue light. And they can also code that to be expressed, that glowing color to express when certain kinds of genes are activated. And so it's one way we can study the biology of not only fish, but humans too, through this special property that we ultimately derived from a jelly. Pretty cool. So what are some of the most dangerous jellyfish? Well, there is, of course, the Portuguese man-o-war, which is probably the one that a lot of people encounter. And this can be kind of tricky because the floating bell will wash up onto the beaches, but the tentacles can be several meters long. And so even though the bell is kind of floating or flopping around there on the beach, the tentacles might be a couple of feet away from it, and you might brush up against those tentacles, even though the animal looks like it's right over there a couple of feet away. And so you always got to be careful about that and look very closely if you see a Portuguese man-o-war, either in the water, avoid it, of course, or washed up on the beach. And then the other crazy ones are called the box jellies, the cubomedusa, and those usually have 4 tentacles on them that are chock-a-block full of those stinging cells, and some of them are quite potent, have the potential of actually killing a human being. Now, fortunately, here in the Caribbean, we don't have a lot of species of box jellies nearby to us here in Sarasota, but they are quite prevalent over in the Indo-Pacific, especially around Australia. In fact, some swimmers over there have to wear special skin suits to avoid being stung by box jellies or those kinds of sea wasps that could potentially not only harm them very severely, potentially send them to the hospital. So box jellies would be some of the most dangerous out there in the world. Well, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed celebrating World Jellyfish Day with me. And again, here at Mote, we study not only jellies, but also their relatives, the corals. They're very important parts of our ecosystem, we've discovered. Does anyone have any guesses why jellyfish might be important parts of marine ecosystems? And you can kind of see it on display right here. It's a little cannonball jelly swimming on through. So some jellies can actually be predators of fish. We've learned that. They can eat fish and other things out there in the ecosystem, so they're an important part of the food web. But they, in turn, are oftentimes eaten by other critters, including, here you can see our loggerhead sea turtles snacking on one of the moon jellies. Sea turtles love to eat jellyfish. In fact, the leatherback sea turtle, the largest sea turtle in the world, eats almost nothing but jellies of one kind or another, either true jellies or their cousins, the tunicates and scyphozoans, but it makes up a majority of their diet. And they have to eat a lot of them in order to get enough nutrition, because remember, most of the bodies of the jellies are made up of water. Unfortunately, we are putting things into the ocean that kind of look like jellies, but don't taste like them at all. You see those floating plastic bags right there? Yeah, that's garbage that's washed into this smack of jellyfish, which could potentially be confused by the turtles for their favorite food. So we tell you, don't release balloons or plastic out into nature. These balloons that you're have at a party. Whatever goes up must come down, and about 70% of the world is covered by water in one form or another. And as the balloons pop and get sun bleached, they can look a lot like the jellies that the turtles like to eat. They can ingest them, and it can be very bad news for them. All right. And any final questions out there, go ahead and type them into the chat. Now's your time before we wrap up our Jellyfish Jamboree today here. Animals eat the algae that live on them. Yeah. So if they're eating the jellies that have the algae inside their tissue, they're not only snacking on the jellyfish themselves, they're also potentially eating up some of that nutritious algae too. In fact, a lot of animals out there snack on corals, which we learned are relatives of the jellies. And the corals have that algae inside their tissue. And so parrotfish and a few other animals will come down and munching crunch on the corals and love to snack on that too. But the corals can recover and regrow. And that's part of the restoration techniques we've actually learned here at our lab. Yeah, you would not want your pets to eat a jellyfish, a box jelly, or any kind. That could potentially be a fatal meal for them. So I don't know that dogs would necessarily want to eat a living jellyfish, though. So definitely be careful of that. And if you're in the Australian waters, maybe watch out for your pets as well as yourself if you're anywhere where box jellies live. And some of the most colorful jellies are actually their relatives, the corals. They can be all kinds of colorful blues, greens, yellows, and oranges. And some of them can fluoresce as well. And there are a few deep sea species of jellies that can also bioluminesce. They can literally glow in the dark. They have special proteins in their tissue that'll actually allow them to strobe and blink and flash underwater. So that can be quite beautiful as well. All right, my friends, thank you so much for tuning on in today. Remember, we're going to be, excuse me, I got the date wrong here again. It's November 5th, this Wednesday. We'll be talking with Julie Hendry about wisdom from the wild and her leadership ideas. And so I hope you can tune in for that. And also stay tuned to mote.org/Marvin for additional programming, including a Salamander Saturday coming up in March, or May, rather, of next year. And that's it for me. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.